Good day everyone, this is the report of Group 2 and I am Ray Bahenteng Flores, the first presenter for this day. And I have given this task to report and it is all about the modifiers of human acts. First is we cite this principle. The greater the knowledge and the freedom, the greater the voluntariness and the moral responsibility. Panizo 38. Given from this principle, personally, I have came up with the idea that if a person possess a greater knowledge and he understand what he does or what he made, and he apply those understanding to his freedom as a person, then his will to act will increase, and also he might be obliged or accountable for any moral responsibility as a consequences of his will. Or it's just having a greater knowledge and having a greater freedom, it corresponds to having a greater voluntariness and greater moral responsibility. It's just give and take. If we possess greater knowledge and freedom, then we must give moral responsibility and voluntariness with regards to what we receive. Next is, man does not act in a vacuum. He is an organism responding and reacting to stimulus. His total makeup is the sum of all experiences. His personal background, education, social upbringing, political persuasion, religion, and personal aims contribute largely to his development and behavioral preferences. They says that no man in an island, man cannot stand alone, that's why God created Eva for Adam. It is just the fact that we're just human. We have these imperfections and incapabilities. We have these different backgrounds that influence our mindsets or that influence our totality. Our perspective was based from what we've learned from our experiences. Since human is a build up of experiences, since experience is the best teacher for us, because most of our learning came from what we've experienced. And also, as it's different, the fact that we have these differences that makes us unique, it includes that we need to collaborate and cooperate with one another in order for us to grow individually. Since we have these qualities that the others don't possess, but we have these things that we cannot do, but the others can't do. So we need each other, we need to be fit in one another in order for us to grow and to be bolder as we could. Next is, since the main topic that was given to me is all about the modifiers of human act, so this are the modifiers. First is ignorance, second is passion, next is fear, next is violence, habits, and others are hypnotism, brainwashing, mental conditioning, cultural imposition. And these modifiers will be elaborated or will be discussed by the next reporter. But first is, what is ignorance? Ignorance defined as the absence of knowledge which a person ought to possess. The knowledge here must be possessed by a person in order for him or her to be not ignorant. Since ignorant defined as the absence of knowledge, understanding, and he possessed lack of awareness about such thing. To be not an ignorant, be knowledgeable first. Acquire knowledge first. Pero ang pagiging ignorante ay hindi siya ganun kamasama para sa atin kasi we've been born in this world ignorant. But through times and through process we'll learn. We cure ourselves from being ignorant. Ignorance of the law excuse no one. It implies that one should not act in a state of ignorance and that one who done a wrong may not claim ignorance as a defense, since we human itself possess morality to distinguish what is right from wrong. So if we commit such wrongdoing and we use ignorance as our defense, and our defense or our reasons, it is not a valid to be considered by the law. Next is just example. A lawyer is expected to know his law, the doctor is his medicine, and the manager is his business operation. It cannot be the doctor expert. The doctor must be knowledgeable or about law since his expertise focused to medicine. Lawyer, doctor, manager here achieve their personal or their situation of being lawyer, doctor, medicine, or manager because they undergo such trainings and such process, including the education they got to be qualified of being a doctor, lawyer, and a manager. So being lawyer, manager, it requires knowledge and experience. So the difference is that you cannot be a lawyer, you cannot be a doctor, you cannot be a manager if you are incapable of being one of them. Next is the types of ignorance. The vincible ignorance. First is we have this vincible ignorance that defines as can be easily reminded through ordinary diligence and reasonable efforts. If we define vincible as ignorance or vincible alone from ignorance, it is defined as capable of being overcome. So, if we define it together, it is a type of ignorance possessed by the individual that individual itself can be or can overcome it. Just like for example, the ignorance of a visitor regarding in a particular place, a particular address in a certain place is vincible. Yes, of course, since he can easily ask information from a policeman or a pedestrian. That visitor here could overcome his ignorance through asking information from a policeman or a pedestrian. As the definition of vincible ignorance, it can be uh, reminded through ordinary diligence and reasonable efforts. If a person possesses vincible ignorance, exerts some efforts, then he might overcome or he might cure his here ignorance. Next is offensible ignorance. It is a second type of ignorance that a person possesses without being aware of it or having awareness of it but lacks the means to rectify it. It is the type of ignorance that the agents or the person who possesses it commits such action with a good conscience, or he commits such action without knowing that he commit act of ignorance. It is the type of ignorance that cannot be dispelled by any means. Just like for example here, a cook might not be unaware that the food he is serving is contaminated. So the ignorance of a cook, since he might be familiar or he might first check the level of its ingredients that he used in a certain dish. So the cook here acts an invincible ignorance. Since he is a cook, then he might be aware that the food he's serving is contaminated. This is questionable. So next is the affected ignorance. But to clarify, there are two main types of ignorance, the vincible and the invincible. The affected ignorance is just a subordinate or under na po siya sa vincible ignorance. So, proceed. Affected ignorance is a person keeps by positive efforts in order to escape responsibility or blame. It is the type of ignorance that deliberately fostered in order to avoid any obligation that knowledge might bring to light. Just like for example here, an employer refuses to read a memo precisely so that he may be exempted from its requirement. Affected ignorance is also known as a pretend ignorance. The employee here refused to read a memo, so it is pinili niyang hindi basahin ang memo for him to be safe from the requirements of the memo. Or ito yung it is the person itself or the agent refuse to remain or intends to remain ignorant to avoid sanction. Pinili niyang hindi gawin ang mga bagay na meron na siyang alam para maging exempted siya or maging safe siya from the fact na it requires values. It requires such things at consequences of being aware of it. Next is, it is the principle of ignorance. First is the invincible ignorance. Renders an act involuntary. A person cannot be held morally liable if he is not aware of his state of ignorance. Of course, as what I have said earlier, that the person possessed it commits such actions with a good conscience. Ito yung the person cannot be hindi siya liable for his actions since he is purely innocent about it. Just like for example here, a waiter who is not aware that the food he is serving has been poisoned cannot be held for a murder? Yes, of course. Since he is just a waiter, the mindset he had or the mindset he had is just to do his duty as a waiter. He is not a taster for his um customer. Next is Vincible ignorance does not destroy but lessens the voluntariness and the corresponding accountability over the act. A person who commits aware of the state or a person who becomes aware of the state of being ignorant, he is has the moral obligation to rectify it by exercising reasonable diligence in seeking the needed information. From the given example from the previous slides that if a visitor asks an information from a pedestrian, then he might be obliged to perform such action as a response to the information given by the pedestrian. So another example here. A waiter who suspects that the food he's serving has been laced with poison has the moral obligation to ascertain the fact or to at least forewarn the guest about his suspension. So if the waiter, from the given example, a waiter is already doubt his food that he was serving, then as a means to rectify it, and to clear his to perform his moral responsibility, then he must forewarn the guest he was serving. Next is affected ignorance. Through it decreased voluntariness, it increased the accountable over the resultant act. Interferes with intellect, it decreased accountability. Refusing to rectify ignorance implies malice. The malice is greater when the ignorance is used as an excuse for not doing the right thing. Kasi it is not the right decision to pretend or hindi siya tama na gawing rason ng pagiging ignorante para lang iwasan ng paggawa ng tama. Just like for example here, a child who refused to be guided by his parents has only himself to be blamed for his wrongdoing. So we all know that parents is here for us to provide guidance. But in a given example, a child refuses it, or the child refused from the guidance provided by his parents, so that he might be accountable for what he made or what his decision. Kasi the child refused it, and of course, as a consequences, he might be accountable for any blame for his wrongdoings. Next is the passion or concupiscence. The concupiscence defined as a strong sexually desire lust simply passion. Then passion are either tendencies away from undesirable or harmful things. It is the tendencies toward desirable objects or tendencies away from undesirable objects or harmful things. It is the proneness of a person from desirable and undesirable objects. Next is we have in the fashion we have these two different emotions. The positive emotions, which is known as former, such as example is love, desire, delight, hope, and bravery, while the latter is a negative emotions such as hatred, horror, sadness, despair, fear, and anger. Passions are psychic response. It could be moral or immoral. Passions are either antecedent or consequent. The two types of passion is antecedent or consequent. So first is we have this antecedent passion. As its type are those that precede an act. It may happen that a person is emotionally aroused to perform an act. Just like for example here, a lengthy phone calls to his sweetheart or to plot the murderer of a rival. It is from the given PDF. I have read there that the cause of these two outcomes here in example is just the positive emotions of love. As what passion it is the psychic response. It could be moral or immoral. So the moral here is to leave lengthy phone calls to his sweetheart, and the immoral is to plot the murderer of a rival. The positive emotions of love push the agent or the doer to leave phone calls or to plot murder. Antecedent passion is it occurs spontaneously before the judgment of a reason and before the will can control the psychological situation. So this is the principle of antecedent passion. It do not always destroy voluntariness, but they diminish accountability for the resultant act. Antecedent passion weaken the will power of a person without, however, completely obstructing his freedom. It is called as crimes of passion. And since it occurs before the will can control the psychological situation or the psychological situation of a person. So it is the antecedent passion. Next is we have this consequent passions are those are intentionally aroused and keep. It is different from antecedents and it is involuntary as a type, not as a principle. Here is consequent passion as a type. It is intentionally, it is involuntarily. So example, a young man may deliberately arouse himself by reading pornographic magazines. Next is a victim of injustice may intentionally nurse his resentment towards his tormentor. The young man who commits lasciviousness after arousing himself sexually. First is consequent passion. It aroused by the will in order to ensure a more prompt and willing operation. So just like for example, in the first example, a young man may deliberately arouse himself by reading pornographic magazine. So the choice or the will of our young man focused to read pornographic magazines in order for himself to satisfy his desired. So, and also from the third example, the young man who commits lasciviousness after arousing himself sexually. So it is his choice. The in his in this consequent passion, the agent controlled by their voluntarily act or their will. Consequent passion as its principle. It do not lessen voluntariness but may even increase accountability. This is because consequent passion are the direct results of the will fully consents to them instead of subordinating them to its control. Since consequent passion, it is a type of, because it is the kind of passion that are deliberately excited and they are the voluntarily in themselves. So another example is just reading or watching immoral literature in order to entice or arouse the intellect and the will for another evil act. Just like for example, and again in the first example, a young man may deliberately arouse himself by reading pornographic magazines. So that actions of him may lead to another evil act which is masturbation.
Good day, everyone. My name is Ken Laguardia, and this is the continuation of our report. So, fear. Fear it is a disturbance of the mind of a person who is confronted by impending danger or harm to himself or loved ones. So, meaning to say, an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone is dangerous, likely to cause pain or trait. Fear is something that you are afraid of, like an introverted person who are afraid of being crowded places, otherwise to be interacted with other people. Principles of fear. First, acts done with fear are voluntary. A person acting with fear is acting in spite of his fear and is in full control of himself. In this case, fear is normal response to a danger. Such actions are voluntary because the doer is in full control of his faculties and acts in spite of fear. Example, climbing a cliff, flying an airplane through a storm, diving for pearls, arresting a nurturous killer. So this fear is voluntary and you have a full control to yourself and you are already knows what happened. Second, acts done out of a fear. However great, it's simply voluntary, although it is also conditionally voluntary. Fear here becomes a positive force compelling a person to act without careful deliberation. Fear modifies the freedom of doing, inducing the person to act in a certain predetermined manner, even without his full consent. Example, the child read his book out of the mother, so that the child need to read the books in front of his mother to become proud and don't make them mad or anger. Another example, The employee volunteers to work overtime out of fear of being fired by the boss. So this is the conditionally voluntary of acts done out of fear. Next is acts done because of intense of fear or panic are involuntary. Means obscures the mind. In this mental state, the person is not expected to think sensibly. Example, a person in a state of panic might jump from the 12th floor of a burning building. In this case, because of panic, the person cannot think properly, so that the person might jump from the 12th floor of a burning building. Okay, next, violence. Refers to a physical force exerted of a person by another free agent for the purpose of compelling said person to act against his will. Means a behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, and violence against people. Example, bodily torture. Torture is an act of deliberately inflicting severe physical or psychological suffering on someone by other as an punishment or in order to feel some desire of the torture or force some action from the victim. Next is maltreatment. Maltreatment is what happens when a person or animal is abused or deliberately harmed. Next is isolation. Isolation is the state of being alone or away from others. Example is a prisoner in solitary confinement. And next is the mutilation, an act or instance of destroying, removing, or severely damaging a limb or another part of body of a person or animals. Principles of violence. First is external action or commanded action, performed by a person or subjected to violence to which reasonable resistance has been offered, are involuntary and are not accountable. So, meaning to say that someone is ordered to do, or the person doesn't have a choice, and they must do it, or face the consequences. Actions that are carried out by the mind and the body that are ordered by the will. For example, of external action or commanded action, murders, injuries inflicted, and impure conduct. Next is elicited acts, or those done by the will alone, are not subjected to violence and are therefore voluntary. So it's an actions that you were persuaded to do and the person has a choice whether they want to do it or not. For example, wish, intention, consent. So wish means it's a natural inclination of will towards an object. Intention, the will's tendency towards something attainable but not obligatory. Last is consent, is the acceptance of will, implementation, the agent's attention. So this is an example of elicited action. Habits means is learned behavior that becomes reflexive over time. The behavior is often triggered by a certain context. Habits is a lasting readiness and facility, born of frequently repeated acts. Meaning to say, you do something repeatedly of your action for acting certain manners. The word habit framing that we use to refer to a certain experience show how easy it is for one to acquire a habit. For example, you may automatically go brush your teeth after finishing your breakfast as a part of your morning routine. A habit can be healthy, unhealthy, or neutral. Habit is not easy to overcome or alter. Alcoholism and smokers find it almost impossible to reform because if you are taking cigarettes and drinking alcoholic drinks, it is not easy or impossible to reform or change your behavior and attitude because you are addicting to use it. Principle of habit. Action done by force of habit are voluntary in cause, unless a reasonable effort is made to counteract the habitual inclination. Habits are either good or bad. Example of good habit: eat healthy foods every day, exercise every day, play outdoors with friends, saying thank you, please, po, and opo. So that example of good habits. Example of bad habit is drinking alcoholic drinks, smoking cigarettes, not sleeping enough, not exercising. So that is the bad habit. Habits are voluntary in cause because they are the result of previously wild acts done repeatedly as a matter of fact.
Good morning, ma'am. The topic that assigned to me is all about act and emotion and requirement of emotion and kagandahang loob. First, action and emotion. Man does not act the way a robot does without feelings or emotion. Sinasabi dito na tayo mga tao daw ay di tulad ng mga robot na walang pakiramdam at damdamin. Second, emotions are generally instinctive in origin. Neither the degree of their intensity, clarity, or awareness makes them human act to be judged as good or evil. They become good or evil by the attitude of the person manifesting them. So, ang damdamin daw ng tao ay likas na pinagmulan at ito ay ating kalinawan at kamalayan. Ang dahilan kaya tayong mga tao ay humahatol sa kilos ng iba kung ito ba ay mabuti o masama. Third, a person who nourish his feeling or hostility toward another is more prone to acquire the motive for inflicting harm on the object of his hatred. So, sinasabi dito na ang tao daw ay pinangangalagahan ng kanyang pakiramdam na puot sa iba ay mas madaling makamit ang motibo na nagdudulot ng pinsala sa ating or sa kanyang kinainisan. Second topic is refinement of emotion. First, emotion as factors affecting human motivation and behavior. So, sinasabi dito na dahil sa ating emosyon, naapektuhan ang ating motivation at pag-uugali. Second, man is expected to act not only with his mind and body, but precisely with his soul and heart. So, tayo mga tao daw ay gumagawa ng mga bagay na hindi lamang sa ating pag-iisip at katawan, kundi pati na sa ating puso at kaluluwa. Third, doing good for another is not a virtue unless it's come from the love of what is good. So kung tayo ay may ginawang mabuti sa iba, di daw yan masasabing kabutihan kung ito daw ay hindi nanggaling sa ating pagmamahal. Bernard Herring says that education through proper discipline and cultivation of emotion life in which we include the cultivation of the values of characters and disposition, and in many ways more significant that the tense is training of willpower. The aims of ethics is not to turn man into an efficient machine to do things, rather its hope to transform man in inner spiritual conversation. Filipinos refers to as kagandahan ng loob. It refers to attitude. Mapagmahal, maunawain, may pakiramdam, may pakikiramay, matulungin, masayahin, at hindi mapagkunwari. And that's all. Thank you.